Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to a very special episode of In the Clouds here on Red Hat Live Streaming. I am Chris Short, host and showrunner of Red Hat Live Streaming. I'm joined by a few of my favorite fellow Red Hatters, Kirsten Newcomer, Andrew Clay Schaefer, and Jamie Scott. Today we're talking about DevSecOps, shifting left, and all things, security from a holistic perspective. So this is part 2 of the series. We did part 1 on the Level Up Hour, and I'm going to grab the link to that. Kirsten was so nice to join us during a session for the Level Up Hour. So thank you for doing that, Kirsten. But, while I'm doing that, let's debate if cheesecake is a cake or a pie. And I think Andrew had one of the better answers in the pre-show run-up to this, I feel like.
You want the whole answer? I started by saying this is kind of like the particle wave duality problem.
Yes.
So it can manifest as it needs to, depending on what we're trying to do at the moment. And then I started working on establishing a taxonomy of the qualities that a pie has and the quality that the cake has. We can start to build up to the types of cheesecake that are going to manifest as a pie or cake, depending on your perspective, the observation that you're making on the system.
Correct. There you go.
Yeah.
There you have it, folks.
and then we got into if hot dog is a sandwich, but
right. Cheesecake is not a sandwich. We did figure that
out.
No,
we did, yes. And in my house, the taxonomy is height. It's a pie. A cheesecake is a pie when it's cooked in a pie dish, and it's about the height of a pie. And it's a cake when you buy it from the Cheesecake Factory, and it's about 6 inches or more.
Nine layers of cheesecake somehow crammed on top of each other, yeah.
If that were the criteria, then every cheesecake I made would always be a pie, and everyone else made.
My mother always made pies, cheesecake pies.
Right, exactly. So I like Andrew's answer the most, though, because it's pretty much it's whatever the hell you want it to be. So there you go.
What do you need it to
be? What do you? Yeah, what do you
call
need
it? The Cheese Pie Factory, though.
I'm gonna petition them to change their name to Cheese Pie. So we've done this rather long experiment of asking people what they think, and we all think it's pie. So you should. Anyways, enough about cheesecake. What exactly is shift left? What do we mean when we say shift left, Andrew?
Well, I think we have to start with recognizing that that's framing things from languages that read left to right. And typically we draw charts that go left to right, which is not true for everyone on this planet. But it's getting involvement and accountability earlier in the process, right? So if you're in the DevOps community or if you're in the DevSecOps community conversation, but even previous kind of iterations of this in lean manufacturing and all these other kind of process automation, process improvement, there's a general theme of making the feedback loop shorter, the accountability, as close to the actor as possible. And in order to do that, you need those inputs as far left in the process, assuming you believe that the things start on the left,
right,
as you can get them.
Amazing. So, Kirsten, what, in your words, what is DevSecOps and how does shift left apply in the context of DevSecOps?
That's great. And I'm sure that we'll have additional comments from Andrew and Jamie.
I've been known to make inflammatory comments about this and ops on the internet.
So I'm going to try and pick my words a little more carefully than in the pre-show, right? So as an organization adopts DevOps, there is a tendency to kind of really focus on dev and ops and helping them, making the changes that help them to work together better. Although if you were to look at like a book like the Phoenix Project, security is absolutely intended to be part of a DevSecOps approach to delivering software. It can get forgotten. And so the reason I think that we see the emergence of the phrase DevSecOps is it's a much more explicit way of calling out that security needs to be an integral part of this process.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, in the pre-show conversation, and I was in the room, there was always a security presence in the DevOps conversations, but it was really these like forward-leaning kind of people. And I'm going to make another comment in a second about DevOps and DevSecOps that were part of that conversation. And what I like about using DevSecOps is that explicit invitation to the more traditional security community to come into the conversation. So I think there was always a security theme in a lot of the DevOps movement, a lot of the DevOps people, but that explicit invitation is nice. And then another thing I think is worth pointing out is, and this is related to the transition in the practices of operations, also in the practice of security, is that the practices are not standing still. And what looks like, and we saw this trend with operations, we're going to see this trend with basically everything, software is eating the world, if you will, that operational practice became more and more about writing APIs, writing this code that did all this work, right? Infrastructure as code. And you're starting to see the same type of work where a security professional in 2021 needs to have like some understanding of code, needs to be able to express some of the policies, some of the practices as code. And so there's the dev part of the developers making product, but there's also the dev part of security professionals contributing to that outcome.
Absolutely. And I think that's a place I'd also be interested to hear from Jamie about this, because he and I talk a lot. Like if you look at kind of some of the tooling that supports this shift, and you kind of think about a typical, I don't know if there is such a thing as a typical security engineer, but security teams in a lot of enterprise organizations today, they historically have not needed to be familiar with the CI/CD process. They have not needed necessarily to understand things like YAML. And as we look at this
nobody understands YAML.
At least I can read it. But fair enough.
YAML is the reason why I went from spaces to tabs. My tabs are now 2 spaces. So I mean, just to give you an idea of,
you see incomprehensible keys and
yeah, but one of our early one of our OpenShift customers who decided to use the adoption of containers as an inflection point for really moving to a DevSecOps approach to deploying their solutions, their chief of cybersecurity decided that he was going to require his security engineers to learn the CI/CD process and to learn things like YAML in order to kind of contribute and participate in that DevSecOps pipeline. And so it's not we're not allowed to share their name, but there's actually this great YouTube video out there of them talking about, so they kind of outed themselves, but of the organization talking about how they tackled this transition. But Jamie, I know this is something you and I have talked about a few times.
Yeah, so to me, shift left is a strategic business decision that starts with culture. But the end goal is not necessarily the end goal is to reduce cost while maintaining compliance, because at the end of the day, security has traditionally been an expense center in order to meet new revenue goals and break into decreased sales cycles. And ultimately, as you begin to look at DevSecOps as a whole, you see that security has a huge opportunity to contribute to the bottom line. And when you look at it from that perspective, you see that by reducing the cost of testing by shifting left, you can fix bugs more effectively, you can plan, you can make prioritization decisions in order to not bolt things on. And I've practiced this for years at this point. And what we really see is it starts with culture. And what you were saying about security engineers being a committer, I personally view that security has traditionally been an auditor role. And DevSecOps is a means to give them skin in the game and say, if you're going to help contribute to this. And that's something that I think is a really valuable mindset shift for the security community.
It's a mindset, and it's a skill set shift as well. But that's part of what creates a lot of resistance in some of these organizations. And there's a lot of work to do, and we're helping do that work. But when you start telling people you got to do this thing this new way, and they've attached their identity to the task that they've done for maybe a decade in some cases, then there's a lot of work to do to get people not just to the culture or like mindset of it, but like to accept that they're going to be able to contribute, because they're kind of afraid to make that step.
Yeah, and you've both mentioned culture, and I'd agree that's absolutely key. And I think you have to, like, people respond to how they're measured also, and what incentives are put in front of them. And so, Andrew, like you're saying, there's what's their existing identity, and how have they built that up? And that's probably been built up partly by previous modes of measurement. And that, I like what Jamie said about the auditor, security as an auditor versus a committer. And so it's really critical that the executives and the managers help provide new incentives and a different way of measuring to help teams pick up these new skills and feel good about making that change.
So something I say on a very frequent basis, interacting with our customers right now, is if you show me your org chart and your funding models, I'll predict what's going to be hard for you.
Interesting.
And so, like, there's this other thing, I think, and maybe this is the setup for the cheesecake conversation. but security is not one thing.
True.
Right.
When you think about security and what security professionals do in organizations, and I've seen different versions of this, but you could probably break it down in like 15 different types of activities, responsibilities, depending on the maturity, depending on the rigor. Another thing that's interesting, so like I did tons of automation projects for the last 15 years, and especially in the regulated organizations, the bottleneck of those investments always ends up being about security, but governance, risk, and compliance, like, which are kind of not the same, but also related. And then when you get deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, you start to realize the risk people and the security people, they're not necessarily aligned.
True.
They don't necessarily see this.
Very true. Yeah.
Right? So there's lots of work to do.
Yeah. And I think compliance teams, like, or one pattern I've observed, right, is that compliance and risk people have, or in particular compliance, but they've provided these guidelines based on known traditional architectures and kind of the ways applications worked, pre-containers, pre-Kubernetes, pre-cloud. And oftentimes the people responsible for implementing those things don't know the why behind the requirement. They just know that they've been given a requirement. And that makes it hard to change as well.
The implementers don't know the why. Sometimes the compliance people don't know the why either. Right?
I'd agree.
And you end up where, and this is sort of the point I think Jamie was making a minute ago, that it's this academic rubber stamp after the fact with an audit that, we check these boxes, we're in compliance. There's lots of blurry things where, are we in compliance? Well, we'll just sign off on it because it's like 10,000 lines of code or whatever, and then we'll figure it out later. But there's lots of, this is the beautiful thing about where some of this is going, is that you can actually be in compliance, verified, audited in a way that you never could before, as you start to modernize the policy and have the policy be enforced by this code itself instead of by a human checklist audit after the fact.
I really like what you said there. The reason why is because I don't think you've been in the security community long enough if you haven't been called a blocker. It's true. And ultimately, this is the feedback that you get from every development team. And parts of it is because you're not applying that why rationale. So I'll give you an example. An HSTS header is something that upgrades your browser from HTTP to HTTPS. It's a very frequently flagged as a low or medium risk and gets talked about. But I've seen applications that literally don't even turn on HTTP. So there's no point in upgrading them. But these risks still need to be accepted. But there is no risk. So the ability to apply that mindset in an automated fashion and bridge that gap between of the whys is really the core concept here of you have product managers who don't understand security and they're responsible for the why typically. You need a champion to be responsible for that why.
And I think this is also going back to the shifting left. You need that conversation to happen before those things are implemented, not something you come back and rework. And unless you want to spend all the money you don't have.
And one of the interesting things about code too is it, in some ways, maybe it's like, how do you make sure that that why is captured as you implement compliance as code and security as code, because the how behind may be different. And so, you know, do you ensure that there's a comment that documents the intent? Really kind of interesting element to think through.
Yeah, and I think one of the core issues with that is the world is limited. Security mindsets like that are just not scalable. We can talk about education all we want, but it's just an unrealistic numbers problem that we have. So shift left through automation at least helps bridge that gap, because it's unrealistic to think that we can educate the world to be a security-centric mindset. Not everyone is going to be able to be a CISP or a pen tester overnight. So
No, it's never going to happen overnight.
So a lot of the conversation I talk about, you know, ilities and itities, and you know that would be things like reliability, and security would be one of them. And the idea that you can make all of your developers experts in distributed systems and building, you know, reliability and scalability and all these things into their applications is just not possible. Like it's at the scale and the complexity. You want the platform to be able to keep all those promises, those architectural decisions that are going to give you the scalability, reliability. And this is really the model that you see evolved inside of Google with SRE, to be honest, that the developers get to focus more and more on their business logic on the domain. Things like scalability are solved because they're writing to those libraries, they're writing to those systems that can keep those promises. And security is just another thing that you want to bake into that architecture, into those platform services. So the developers are not going to be experts in security, and they don't have to be.
Thankfully. Right. So with that in mind, and I apologize if you hear my dog barking, someone is here to do something and they're not going away. So if you hear my dog, my apologies.
We like dogs.
I like dogs. Yeah.
Bark back at them.
So how can organizations foster this culture that we've talked about, right? Like emphasize the value of security for everyone? Can we look at it from a top-down perspective? Can we even try to make it a bottom-up perspective? I mean, what is that kind of genesis point for making this happen, the paradigm shift happen?
There's a lot to unpack, right? If you start talking about the way, like, I think culture gets kind of thrown around, and we already did it a little bit on this thing where it's like it's the truth, but it's also sort of inactionable. It's hard to like go implement culture, right? And so what I try to help people think about is what are the behaviors you're trying to get, and then what are these kind of practical activities you could do, and then also be mindful about the incentives. You know, the org structures and incentives that have been set up. But there's really simple things that in a lot of organizations, just as it evolved dynamically with whatever kind of silos in history, these roles don't even really interact with each other as human beings, right? It's all through ticket systems. And this might sound a little bit platitudinal, but you can fix some of these problems just by getting people to go to lunch together, just by getting people in proximity with each other.
Absolutely. And I think, kind of you alluded to this, I think, and I brought it up earlier, many organizations do have measurements that they use to kind of assess various elements of what they're doing. And, I've been in organizations where, for example, one of the measurements for a development team was the number of lines of code delivered on a regular basis, which frankly, I think is not a useful measurement.
No, it's a terrible measurement.
It doesn't
All you're
really
going to
tell
get
you
is
anything.
a lot of code that doesn't do anything necessarily.
And so I think, an interesting thing to look at is mean time to resolution for newly discovered security issues, and potentially you could look at what point in the life cycle were those issues discovered as well. And ideally, the earlier they're discovered, the easier it is to address them. Now, that's never 100% true because, until you know what the issue is, you don't know what the fix is. But I still think an organization really needs to take a look at their measurements, which is one form of incentive.
Mm-hmm.
Just add to that a bit, Kirsten. One of the things I see is that the security team is measured based on the number of things they find. And the development team is measured on the speed at which they can deliver business value. And these are just totally conflicting incentives. And that's one of the things that really bothers me about our organization, because security professionals at the highest levels are taught it is okay to accept risk. If you have a $2 million risk in a $100 million deal, you're going to accept that $2 million risk for that chance at $10 million. It's a simple math problem, despite the fact that there might be potential security impact. And I am a CISP. So like me saying accepting risk is fine is almost counterintuitive to the standard security persona. But that's how these setups are designed. And the incentives that we have of find all the bugs and deliver things fast are just too conflicting right now. So if you can change the incentives to say, if we are able to make more appropriate risk management decisions, then I think the entire conversation changes.
Nice. So let's talk about policy, right? Like there's all kinds of policy out there, right? We've got regulatory policy, we've got security policies, we've got, internal organizational policies. But usually the best way to deliver a compliant system is to continuously deliver compliance, right? So thinking about applying policies in the way of against infrastructure to ensure safe deployments or ensure regulatory requirements are met. How would you go about, assessing what your policy enforcement should be within your environment in, any organization, right? Like, is there a process that you normally drive people through, or is it more like, well, it depends on if they're, financial services or something else?
So I think the ideal future state, that we sort of kind of hinted at earlier in this conversation is that you're continuously auditing, and the audit function is enforced by the framework, by the platform itself. And then the security professionals are making those kind of creative investments in managing the risk and thinking about what that policy should be, not trying to audit it, right? Like computers are really good at doing repetitive tasks. So let them audit that stuff all the time. And that's not where most organizations are, right? So then you get to being able to think about, okay, like there's the policy and there's things checking it, like who signed off on it, right? Attestation and chains of trust and chains of responsibility. Like there's a bunch of interesting stuff emerging, and I don't know if we want to get into this here, but with like these transparency logs, and being able to kind of think through or reason about where things came into these pipelines.
Right. And I think, there is some really cool stuff going on, as you say, transparency logs and like the SigStore project and how do we think about all of that throughout the life cycle. I also, I also think it's a piece of the puzzle is, at least in is it what we call in Kubernetes admission controls, right? You can define policies for Kubernetes. I'm sure you can do it for other environments as well in different ways that check elements of the solution that is requesting access or requesting to be deployed. And in that case, kind of one of the things that comes up frequently is that principle of least privilege, right? So can I check for the appropriate privilege request? Now that gets challenging because you might create a policy that's fairly, after all, it's code, it could be fairly black and white. And then if a solution needs certain levels of privileges that you don't allow by default, you're back to an exception process. So you also, there are also interesting tools emerging in that space too that help you define fairly complex policies, OPA and OPA Gatekeeper in the Kubernetes space. And there's another policy engine.
Kyverno?
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Kyverno, in that space as well.
Awesome. Yeah. And I can't emphasize the importance of like treating this as a computer solvable problem, not a human solvable problem, right? Like computers are way better at this than humans could ever be. So
for auditing, yeah,
for auditing purposes,
I like to think of everything in terms of a socio-technical system. So it's augmented intelligence, right? It's not. I think we're pretty far away from saying like this is a computer solvable problem. Like security, securability, these are qualities that come from the socio-technical system, which is the combination of those computing systems and those social systems coming together to deliver. Like you can't, just like you use another analogy from reliability, there's no organization on this planet that thinks that they don't need the SREs, right?
Right.
So you can invest in AI, automation, autonomous systems, whatever, but no one thinks right now in 2021 that you could just turn your back on all this stuff and it's going to be good. And I think that analogy comes over to security as well. It's the socio-technical system that delivers security.
Absolutely. Just we think about facial recognition, right? The facial recognition systems we have today are partly driven by the data that's fed into them, and humans are controlling to some extent what data gets fed into them. That will shift over time, right? But I do think there are some things, So yeah, I'm with you. Humans are always part of it.
Cases. There's always going to be corner cases, and someone better be there that has a clue what's going on.
Someone else's account, for instance, in a banking application. So being able to look at those types of business logic problems is one of the most important things I think that security people can apply themselves to in a socio-technical problem.
So to that point, if you go look at the most of the breaches that happen, very few of them, relatively speaking, are because someone exploited some, CVE or whatever that's like in the system that's technical. There's lots of social engineering that leads to the breaches.
Yeah, I mean, if you just send a phishing email saying free coffee, imagine the hit rate on that if it came from a spoofed email within the org. I mean, I can tell you that as someone who sent those phishing emails, that's my #1 hit.
Free coffee?
Yep.
Did you get Chris back? Or I think that's the machine, Chris.
Or taking advantage of people on Valentine's Day is also good.
Oh, wow. You have to have the particular mindset to do that kind of hacking, huh? So.
You have to be evil.
So, pushing the boundaries a little bit. So are we getting Chris back?
I pinged him, and I don't know the answer. So yeah.
Do you guys want to just go through DevSecOps? Like, how do you guys think organizations foster DevSecOps culture in ways that emphasize the value for security for everyone? We've been talking a lot about culture. How do you think we do that?
Poorly is an answer. There's a lot of people on a lot of different journeys in different places, and we kind of talked about this in the pre-show. There's been lots of investment. So here's this pattern I see right now, right? You go into these organizations and they've got a DevOps team, which is, and this is true, this is a true story, a DevOps team, which is a different silo and a different team than an SRE team. That's a different silo and different team from the DevSecOps team. And you're just like, what are you doing? Right? Like, and maybe even sometimes they'll have like a CI/CD team. It's like you got a DevOps team and a CI/CD team. So I think and this goes back to org charts and funding models. I think it's hard for leaders in some of these organizations, especially when they come from a background where everything's been so structured and siloed, to really set up these collaborative environments and let go of some of the silo building, kingdom building, and let those good practices emerge. And it goes. There's a lot of ways to think through this, but when you've got so many different teams and they have so many different incentives and they're not really working together, then I don't think you got the plot of the DevOps movie.
Yeah, and I ran into this recently with an organization who not only has an infrastructure security team, but they have a cloud security strategy team. And actually, I've seen that emerge in more than one organization, right? As they start to adopt cloud, they create sort of this special team that's looking at cloud security. And so we can get even further siloed as organizations do that.
I mean, it's almost by we've kind of like built this culture where organizations want or individuals want to be kind of empowered, and the only way they can do that is collecting body count and building these orgs and getting these budgets, instead of having kind of like floating funding models where project teams are brought together from pools of resources. You get these long-standing silos that accumulate power over time, and I think that holds a lot of organizations' creative potential back. Not just on security, but on all the other digital initiatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what are some of the things that Red Hat is doing to help? I know there are elements, Andrew, that you're working on, and then Jamie, there's a product set that you're working on, but maybe we start with Andrew and then shift to Jamie.
So security is an interesting one, and there's a number of things that are happening, in conversation with my team, and we are working with product, working with there's some. It's hard to talk about some of this because people don't like their logos or their names like thrown around. But you basically have a lot of big banks, you kind of like a lot of federal agencies. They're really interested in pushing for the state of the art along a lot of the topics that we talked about. On my team publicly, John Willis has been participating in kind of writing these papers about, doing security differently, doing attestations automated with, because it's really coming down to this tension between developer productivity and operational efficiency. And if you can't get this process for doing the automation of the security to contribute to the developer productivity, then it's always the bottleneck, right? And this is especially true in these highly regulated organizations. So across things like financial services, energy, the three-letter agencies or whatever, they have very strict ideas about what their policy should be, what their compliance and security position should be. And so we're working through helping both the tools and kind of like that process, practices, culture side of it to identify the interventions and investments that need to be made to get those better outcomes.
Yeah, and so I know, there are folks in Red Hat who are working on kind of how can we help automate what they call the software factory, right? There can be so many different tools used in a shift left environment.
The artist formerly known as the trusted software supply chain, and
yes.
Plygos, and those are some of the projects supporting the conversation I was just having. Right?
Exactly, right. And so Jamie, kind of when we look at it from the StackRox or the Red Hat Advanced Cluster Security perspective, right? How does ACS help with the shift left and automating security and compliance?
Sure. So one of the things I like to say is we help you to focus on what matters most, and we enable your team in order to do that. Because one of the traditional problems you see in the security industry is that the vulnerability management or compliance team effectively takes a result from a scan tool, tosses it over the wall, and then sends it to the development team, and the development team has absolutely no clue what to do with it. So they'll work to address these, but having that conversation and allowing teams to prioritize what matters most is really critically important. So what Advanced Cluster Security is doing is it's doing your traditional vulnerability management, but looking at it from a different angle by adding security context. And it does that through assumption of what it knows to be in Kubernetes and using the Kubernetes API. So now you can effectively say, if a container is privileged, what that means is that it has effectively root access to the underlying host operating system. So if you manage to get a remote code execution vulnerability, which would give you access to a container, if you get one that's privileged, then you are going to then be able to access all containers within that host effectively, which means you go from compromising one application to potentially hundreds.
Although I always want to be careful to separate the word privilege and root access, because there are so many different types of privilege that can actually be supplied. So is it fair to say that kind of what you're thinking of really requires running as root and access to the host? For example, just like think SE Linux, right? SE Linux can provide some protections. User namespaces help. I know we're getting a little technical here, but Kubernetes doesn't yet support user namespaces. So I think that there's a lot happening to kind of help to put boundaries around some of those attack vectors, but we still need to track them.
Yeah, it's definitely about prioritization to me, because there's always going to be a defense in depth architecture. And at the end of the day, you want to build a layered approach to security where you expect one or two controls to fail. Because ultimately, a mature nation state is going to be able to attack you in a more effective way than someone who has a limited budget. So the goal of the security team is not necessarily to secure all the things. The goal of the security team is to make it too cost prohibitive in order for an attack to be successful.
Proportional to the risk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So ultimately, when I talk about something like being able to prioritize more effectively, saying a privileged container is root on the operating system. That is what it means to be privileged in the context of Kubernetes. Now, that being said, if I have a privileged container, I want to be able to block anything with a network attack vector or an adjacent network attack vector that is a critical vulnerability or a high. And I want to do that instantly. And maybe for a privileged container, I might even want to go down to the medium level for that. So being able to make more informed risk management decisions on what matters most is really key. So what we see is organizations will use labeling strategies with their crown jewel applications and really focus and hone in on what matters most by focusing on that labeling strategy to look at data classification labels. They'll use it to look at if that application is a crown jewel. And by being able to link that context, security teams can make more informed risk management decisions and apply different policy logic. So if an application doesn't have sensitive data, then isn't even exposed to an external network, maybe it's acceptable to have a high risk for that organization. Whereas if it's a crown jewel application that's externally exposed and privileged, maybe you want to start tackling the mediums.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's why that's another place where, again, we need to blend socio-technical, right? So there's some human perspective here, but also the computer and a solution like ACS, right? The software can gather additional data to inform the decision in ways that if you are just looking at vulnerabilities through an SCA analysis, right, a software composition analysis, where they've said, here are the packages in the software, here are the known vulnerabilities associated with that software, here's the MITRE, the NVD rating for those vulnerabilities, that's not enough to really prioritize because you don't have the full context that you're just talking about.
So I like to drag everything back to the center of what I understand, which is DevOps, SRE type stuff. And I think there's an interesting conversation emerging, and I've been part of having some of it around framing some of these conversations through the same lens, right? So when you're talking about risk and reliability, they're not exactly the same, and I think it's easier to measure reliability than it is to measure risk, to be honest. But when you start thinking about SLOs and setting up the targets for the service level, every 9 for reliability, from kind of like a rule of thumb, and this is not a strict rule, but it's pretty close approximation, every 9 costs you 10 times more than the last 9, right? So if you're not willing to make the investment in this to be another 10 times more than the last one, then you have to make that boundary. And that's like framing for SRE as embracing risk. And then a lot of what you're talking about in kind of this subgenre of the DevOps conversation is about observability. Observability from a security perspective. Like what is actually running on these systems? What state are they in now? And how is that state changing? And lets us respond to that, right? So there's all these little sub-genres. I think there's also some interesting analogies with like chaos engineering, pen testing, or whatever. Like there's a lot of these practices that are analogous. But if you don't have an understanding of what's happening in your systems, whether that's from monitoring the performance or monitoring the security aspects, policy aspects, then you don't know what you don't know, and you're going to find out the hard way.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely
or outage.
Yeah, absolutely right about observability. I'm going to ask a question that I get asked, which is interested in the perspective from the two of you. How does DevSecOps shift left help us address ransomware, or does it? And what do you think? What are some of the best practices when we think about ransomware?
So I'll take a stab at ransomware. When I think of DevSecOps, I do not think it addresses ransomware. It helps to mitigate it, though. So ultimately, if you get pwned, you get pwned. There's not really a way around that. So you can mitigate the risk of that ransomware spreading. You can mitigate the risk of lateral movement, and you can reduce the likelihood that you're actually exploited. But that being said, it's unrealistic to think that shift left is in any way going to help address a ransomware attack, because the reality of the vulnerability management space is that it is a moving target. And because it is a moving target and vulnerabilities are updated as they are discovered, then that's why we call them known vulnerabilities, because there are so many unknown.
Yeah.
It's not going to address that, but it'll help mitigate.
Yeah, I'll add to what Jamie said, and it's similar to, like, there's no organization that's not going to have outages, right? Like you're going to have some corner case, some new thing that changes some of the assumptions. But what you can do with these investments is you can have a better understanding of what software is running, how that software came into your system, the policies, and then being able to remediate the known ones is one thing. But the idea that you're going to be able to take care of and prevent every single thing, which is literally an arms race with adversaries, it's just unrealistic.
No, and here's the one place that so there are two things I like to use as an answer. One is, provide as much protection as you can, the way you would normally do. The observability is critical, right? Because you need to also detect and respond. But I think also more and more, the more you can deliver your solutions or manage your solutions as code, and that includes your infrastructure, not just your applications, so that you can position yourself to, with the exception of stateful data, which you're going to have to back up, but if you can position yourself to recover by redeploying, that's a much better approach than trying to scramble through a whole bunch of backups. And also means that if somebody, to use Jamie's phrase, right, if somebody pwns your data, you're just gonna redeploy. It means you have to protect the code systems that you're storing all of that config data and that pipeline in.
So I'm a big believer in being able to repave everything. And that's like the main benefit or primary benefit of being able to rebuild infrastructure from scratch from code, is that you're building things constantly. So recovering is, the same as all your other deploys. At the same time, like, that doesn't necessarily protect you, because you don't know where some of those vulnerabilities came into your supply chain. So you might just be redeploying them anyway. And I understand what Jamie said a minute ago, and use an analogy from like physical security at my house. So I have a security system, and there's like sensors and like all this stuff. But if someone came to my house with like real force, I have glass windows. Like, they're gonna get in the house. Like, it doesn't matter. And like 911 will come maybe later, but like someone could come in this house by force, and there's nothing that security investment will do to prevent.
There is no such thing as 100% security, and we're really just talking about what are some of the approaches to mitigate situations.
I like to use the zombie apocalypse metaphor. In that, if zombies are attacking you, you have a gate. If they get to the gate, you have a house. When they break in through your windows, you better have a door key to lock your room. And your disaster recovery plan at the end is, do you have an escape hatch?
An ejection seat. That's what you need, an ejection seat. Time to get out. Apologies for the technical difficulties, folks. My Comcast issues are being buried right now, meaning the cable is being buried, hence the network loss of connection. So, and the cell networks are not as strong as they were after the storms we had. So, joining from my iPad, as it were. So, thank you all for joining today and discussing this.
We miss your smooth radio voice.
This is true.
Yeah, I'm I'm sure you've kind of gone off the rails, Andrew. I'm not worried about that.
Well, I will say, I think we got a little dark here towards the end. We need some uplifting.
Well, fair enough. So let's just close on this, right? Like, what are you excited about in the next month, year, insert period of time here?
All right, I'm gonna
just go around the room on that one.
Yeah, I'll grab it first. I'm really excited by what's happening with signing transparency logs, the whole SigStore initiative, and investments around attestation. I think there's some really cool stuff happening that will allow us to make zero trust more than just or extend some of what is zero trust today in Red Hat solutions, but extend it to more parts of the process and the software.
Jamie, you want to go next?
You want to go first? I'm thinking. There's too much to be excited about.
Yeah, there's a lot to be excited about. I mean, I'm watching all this stuff emerge with the different kind of open source projects around being able to do identity stuff with Spiffy.
That's another good one.
And the stuff with the audit logs, the transparency logs. That's great. The other thing that I'm faced with, and I'll say this is true about DevOps, the forward-leaning conversations and kind of like the pushing the boundaries of this is one thing, but the vast majority of organizations, in some ways, like they're just getting caught up to DevOps conversations from 2010, right? So to me, like the most exciting thing is about bringing the standard up across the industry, the rising tide that will hopefully lift all these boats.
A lot of boats.
There's a lot of boats. It's a lot of water.
It's a lot of water too. Yeah, you're right. All right, Jamie.
I was someone who came over with the StackRox acquisition. So to me, one of the things that really excites me is to be able to attempt to disrupt the Kubernetes security space at scale. And by transitioning from a startup to a large enterprise with a huge presence in the enterprise space, I want to be able to sit there with a seat at the table with the CISO and really get to understand how we can help to, one, reduce the cost of a security program, but two, help them make more informed risk management decisions.
Awesome. Well, with that note, I think we'll wrap it up for today. And I appreciate you all joining us. Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Andrew. I know you're very busy out there in the world trying to help everybody save the world kind of deal. So I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate it, Chris.
Take it easy, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.